Great. So welcome everyone to kind of a Wednesday session for this London Policy and Strategy Network session. We know kind of many colleagues will be they're hard at work today working on elections, but even more so working hard tomorrow on elections. We haven't put it in the middle of the most important day of democracy of the year. Although there seem to be more and more elections during the year, so maybe it's not the most important one. But really pleased to welcome Michael Wood, who's going to come and talk to us about health on the high street. And I'm really delighted to kind of welcome Michael, because it's such a great example of how we can connect kind of different issues, also different worlds, different practitioners, but as human beings, kind of we all know how pivotal a high street is in our lives, whether that's the high street we live in, the high street we work in, the high street we pass by, the high street we have a shop in, etc. And so that's also pivotal for people from all walks of life, for children, younger people, older people, etc., who use the high street to buy things, to connect, to meet up, to socialise, and health in all its dimensions is massively important. There's also, as you may be aware, for those of you living or working in London, the Mayor of London, as part of the London recovery missions, which I definitely recommend you to check out, and I'll put a link once I've stopped talking. One of the missions is called High Streets for All, and you'll probably be more interested in knowing that there's funding attached to that, with a deadline of the 17th of May. And so obviously this session isn't about helping you prepare for that funding bit. It is about health on the high street, but hopefully it can be some really good ideas that come out of that can help those of you who are already thinking of applying, as well as those of you who may think of applying as a result of these sessions. And there's also a Future Neighbourhoods fund as well by the GLA, which is similar and kind of related to some of the topics that we'll talk about today. So I'm going to hand over to Michael. Welcome, and for everyone, do introduce yourselves in the chat bar. We won't have time for everyone to introduce themselves verbally, but it'd be really great to kind of get a sense of who you are and also what brings you here. Either that might be because you're working on a specific high streets program, or on a health program, or on a different program, or you're just coming here while you're having a sandwich, or out of complete curiosity. All of the above are legitimate reasons to listen in and take part. So over to you, Michael, and welcome.
Thanks, Noel. Hi everyone. And I've been to one or two of these in the past, and it's really made me think with my NHS hat on, in London, actually, about how do we get, a health community doing something similar? How do we interact between health and local government strategy leads and policy leads? And it's always good to catch up with Noel about these issues. Just a bit about me. So I have a national role, first of all, at the NHS Confederation. That is a national membership body for NHS organisations. In normal times, we are housed within the LGA's building in Smith Square, Westminster. So a good example of health and local government working closely together there. That my national role is Head of Health Economic Partnerships. I'm also on part-time secondment to the NHS in London, and that's helping advise on the development of an anchors network. So that's a network to try and unlock the economic and social value of the NHS in London, which Noel's mentioned, the London Recovery Board. This will play an important part of that. So a dual focus for me. Health on the high street, I think, cuts right through them both. I'm going to share some slides in the old school fashion, because my Teams has just changed, and and so if you can't see anything, Noel, you'll shout at me, won't you, if you can't see the slides in front of you?
I can see that. Hopefully others people can as well.
That's brilliant. Just to start with my national role, because it probably makes more sense to a local government audience than an NHS audience, actually, which is I'm interested in the relationships between the health sector and the local economy. So I'm interested in, I guess, that yellow box in the middle, which is, how, if we talk about population health, how are we talking about health and wealth? How are we getting the NHS involved in economic and inclusive growth? And how can we understand what devolution means? How can we influence economic strategies from a health perspective? How can we influence NHS strategies from an economic perspective? So I'm right in the middle of that sort of, that graph there, just to help people understand where my interests are. And often the NHS is seen as that cost rather than an investment. And I think going forward post-pandemic, we need health and public services to operate more in the investment space than the cost space. And that's, of course, about behaviours. Just a bit about where the origins of the high street work. So when obviously the pandemic hit just over a year ago, and our public services went into emergency response and emergency crisis mode, my organisation, membership organisation for NHS Trusts, was wondering how we could support our members to play their immediate health response role, but also to look ahead and say, actually, when we do sort of settle down, whenever that is, how can we keep hold of, understand the change that's been, and what a health and care system for the future should look like, rather than just return to where we were. So we set up a reset campaign, which we launched pretty much exactly 12 months ago, actually, an NHS reset campaign. And my role in this was not just to look at reset through a broad prism, was to understand that actually a health crisis was moving into a health recession, which would move back into a health crisis, and we've seen the cycles and the waves, haven't we? So straight away, about a year ago, I started thinking, well, what is the NHS's role in the coming year beyond simply the health crisis? So I started putting some work together about, what would this mean from a workforce perspective? We are one of the biggest employers anyway. We are one of the few employers still recruiting. We've seen sort of what could our role in civic restoration look like? What could our role in supporting business and supply chains look like, particularly the ones who've perhaps come to us through PPE? Embedding health and sustainability and regeneration mattered. And there's something about those anchor networks. How can we get NHS organisations talking to each other as economic and social agents? So that was my sort of rationale, Noel, in terms of where I'm coming from. And in all of these 5 areas, I was working on different areas of what might be interesting. And I think for me, the high street bit, there's a personal story here. So I live down in Brighton. Normally I would be in London 4 days a week. So I was no longer commuting like lots of people. I'd reconnected with some of my high streets in north part of Brighton. You've seen almost a manifestation of the impact of the pandemic on closed shop fronts, but huge queues outside some of our community businesses, the butchers, the bakers, the craft ale shop, etc., etc. And I was there much more on a much more regular basis. And for me, it got me thinking, well, my high street is the bellwether of prosperity, of the state of the economy. For my part of Brighton, if the high street fails, then my health deteriorates, my wealth deteriorates, and that affects where I am and what I do. So I started thinking, what could the NHS's role in this be? Talking to the colleagues at Power to Change, I'm sure people are familiar with Power to Change, who support community businesses. They were having similar thoughts, and they obviously had a long-standing interest in the high street agenda. So we started to ask ourselves, I guess, the exam question, which is on this slide here. Something about actually, how could the NHS play a role in making our high streets more economically and socially sustainable, but in ways which actually improve the effectiveness and engagement and accessibility of our own services? All too often, as any colleagues on the call who works with the NHS will know, what drives us is often clinical or cost-making decisions. Now, actually, can we broaden our decision-making base to include social value and societal and economic and cultural impacts, but also actually, can we understand how moving our services into communities could improve their effectiveness and engagement and ultimately deliver better outcomes? So that was the exam question we asked ourselves. And we published our report in December of last year. The link's on the bottom of the page. We had a range of colleagues and leaders around the table for our roundtable and for some of this work. Local government colleagues, NHS colleagues. We had Bill Grimsey, who many of you will be familiar with. We had the voluntary sector. We had some developers, and it just struck us that this was an issue. This was a timely issue that actually, was relevant everywhere. And there's some of the key points we went through in terms of, actually, where could the NHS make an immediate impact? We'll say something about that. What are the health benefits of having a regenerated high street? I think for me, there is something about the NHS physically on the high street, other than just community pharmacists, dentists, etc., GP surgeries. But there's something about the ethos of the high street. If it's no longer retail based, for example, how might health and the public services play more of a role in that broader sense of what is a reimagined high street? The role of local government was quite rightly reflected as absolutely critical. Also, the role of the community and how we involve the community. We discussed what we need to drive that positive change, and also, as ever, you come back to the funding, what is quite a complicated landscape. So I'll just start with some of the recommendations. Now, there's a range of recommendations here we made in our report for government, for the NHS, for local bodies such as councils, and mainly, I mean, the recommendations are how to get people talking to each other. I think if you look at what we asked government for, we continue to call for a repurposed high street task force expert panel. How can we get health more explicitly in their remit? Something about aligning the funding landscape, and certainly understanding how the Department of Health and NHS England and the public, other government departments play into that. And there's something there at the bottom about perhaps how can we get the regeneration and government policy planning and funding take into account the impact on health and health services. For the NHS, it's a key time for the NHS, and I'll come on to some bits about how the NHS is changing, where opportunities really are aligning. I think we would like to see future infrastructure, NHS infrastructure capital plans actually specifically talking about social value and about the local economy. That should be the rule rather than the exception. Something about how we can, as NHS, as the health and care sector comes together, how can we embed these principles in there, and how can we make sure that population health goes way beyond simply the traditional prevention agenda and picks up some of these issues. And then something for local authorities and bodies such as LEPs. I think, the big acid question here, which goes back to my overall job, I guess, how can health be seen as that driver of local economic development? As places recover, what needs to happen with spatial planning? How can we get public service delivery in a realm considered as alternative uses, as well as promoting the community-owned element of this, which really has strong links to our well-being. So a raft of recommendations. That's just a snapshot of some. There's plenty of others in the report. I thought it'd be interesting just to touch on some examples that came up in what we were doing. And I noticed Beatrice, the chair of Mersey Care, is on the call, which is fantastic. And Beatrice is one of the very few NHS leaders who is actually an expert on the High Streets Task Force, which is a great read across. So Mersey Care is a foundation, a mental health trust in Merseyside. And I thought this is a relevant example. We'll talk about, I guess, the shopfront examples on the high street, which are very current. But this is an example of an NHS trust taking over a library. This is a library in a pretty deprived part of Liverpool. And, as many local authority colleagues will know, that funding and resourcing public services such as libraries is coming under increased pressure. So this was a great example of, rather than allowing a library to shut, an NHS trust, particularly a mental health trust, realising the severe health impacts of that, made a decision to refurbish and reuse the library. So it maintains an element of, there's an element of service delivery there, but lots about the sort of, the origins of the library services, the wider community services. It really co-produced with service users and other stakeholders, and that's bang in the centre of that community. I think a brilliant example there and we've heard examples similarly of leisure centres. Again, facing challenge. How can we not just share a front desk in a leisure centre? How could we look at how we use physio, MSK services, etc.? How can we bring them together? How can we commission, sports and leisure facilities as part of what makes people healthy? So I think examples like this and Mersey Care, is a brilliant example, which, I can imagine libraries in most parts of the country under severe pressure. We know there are population health impacts of shutting that. Moving down to Ashford in Kent, something which I found really interesting is the One New Kent shop. And this is a joint council NHS development. They actually moved into a shopping centre because the initial development grew too popular. So this is in a shopping centre. in Ashford. Before the pandemic, it had about 500 visitors a month in person there. And what I particularly like about this is there's a range of services, perhaps focused originally on the lifestyle services, but it's now extended based on demand, extended to provide a range of community services, you know, in the shop and in the back rooms. What I get a sense from this is one of the big wins here is actually we are changing the relationship between the NHS and between our citizens. You know, often we all feel that imbalance with our clinicians. You know, well, this is more for me about discussing our own health on our own terms and in our own time. And as the colleagues in Ashford speak about, perhaps some of the GPs, you know, initially were not that interested in this development. But actually, you know, the GPs have come over time to realise that it's certainly helped in terms of their demand. You know, there's GPs will see an awful lot of people for whom their issues aren't clinical. It's people are taking more responsibility for their own health and coming to their GPs with more detailed questions. To, you know, it's advanced them, I think, through their thought process. So the clinical leaders of Ashford now have really, I think, appreciated this example as something which has helped in terms of population health and their demand. So I think a really interesting example there. And lots, what fascinating, you publish a report sometimes, you know, sometimes nationally, we've all had that national policy perspective. You almost feel like you're throwing a pebble in a lake and, you know, there'll be a few ripples and will anything happen? And I think what's happened since we published the report is quite a few different opportunities. And I'll touch in particular on some NHS ones. Clearly, there's an immediate focus for some of this work. We're rolling out vaccinations now. I had mine last week at the racecourse ground in Brighton, but, you know, the Brighton centre's being used. I think, you know, this will be an ongoing thing about vaccinations. How can we run vaccinations from high street sites, which again contribute to that footfall and, you know, and support people in and around the heart of their communities. We've mentioned that blowing the ethos of healthy places through our spatial plans, and there's some interesting opportunities around immediate service delivery with that direct NHS backing. I'll come on to those. From the NHS agenda, a range of issues which are fascinating. So NHS England published last year a strategy on community diagnostic hubs. The former cancer czar Mike Richards talking about how can we provide diagnostic services on the high street. That is a current policy priority agenda for NHS England. Linked to that, which I think is particularly interesting, I've got a slide on something called the Cavell Centres. You'll notice anything new in terms of NHS estate that comes out needs to be named after a very famous former clinician. But the Cavell, I'll talk about the Cavell Centres. What is also interesting is I'm expecting, perhaps CSR dependent, but I'm expecting a revised health infrastructure programme. Now, the health infrastructure plan that was published a few years ago was in effect the government talking about 40 or 48, however many hospitals they were going to build. Now, actually, there will be a revised programme at some point this year, hopefully, which will have much more of an out-of-hospital focus. And that, I think, is particularly interesting in the health and high street environment. We're talking to colleagues, particularly some of the funding pots. You'll see, you know, some of the funding pots you'll well know about how we can look across almost a thematic role of health in government funding. So where can we pull out some great health examples from these funding pots, but also how can we understand and shape some of the funding going forward? And I mentioned I advise on the concept of the NHS anchor network in London. The NHS is a bit behind on this curve. So, the more traditional anchors we know, of course, at the town hall or universities, etc., or voluntary sector housing associations. The NHS is playing catch up, but the NHS, I would say, is far more interested in this space now. What can we do, to support that economic recovery? And so as we develop that concept and understanding and roll it out, I think health on the high street really does, and our capital plans really do play a different role in this. Noel mentioned the High Street Swarm mission in London, particularly. It was great to see this mission and the guidance reflect and reference our Health on the High Streets report. I haven't been too close to local examples coming up in this world, but if people are working with local stakeholders on their their main pitch for their borough, and there's an opportunity for health to be in there. Really keen to discuss that and hear what it said. I mean, this won't be the only sort of example. I mean, I know that boroughs will be looking at many other examples. I'm really interested in how and if health comes to the fore in this mission, and I'll be keeping talking to the GLA and colleagues, but likewise anyone on the call, anyone working locally on something wants to get in touch and say, we think there's an opportunity here, can you link us up, etc. Please do. I mentioned the Cavell centres, and again, there's something here. This is a sneak preview, which hopefully the CSR later in the year will push us on more. There are 6 pilots in England at the moment. The closest one to London is Staines. 6 pilots where NHS England are supporting the development of primary and community care hubs for populations of around 150,000. And these will be situated in the hearts of our communities. And what's interesting here is they will not be owned by individual GPs like many of our primary care hubs are. They will be owned by the system, so by the health and care system. And you'll see there's a real opportunity here. So I think ownership of particularly primary care estate has always been, I'm sure there'll be people on the call who've tried working with at the NHS about what to do about a GP surgery, found it's been owned by an individual GP. It's particularly difficult sometimes to work out what you can do. So ownership is a key issue. The NHS England's trying to get system ownership, but they're trying to understand actually what a reimagined, repurposed health and care or health and well-being offer for 150,000 population might look like. Where might it be based? Who might it work with? How might it bring in a private element or work in partnership with other public service delivery, voluntary sector, etc., etc. So there's 6 examples who are all in different ways trying to embed health and high street principles. Plymouth is a good example where they're looking at siting one of these in a regeneration park. A part of the city where businesses suffer from a severe lack of footfall. I mean, even just a bog standard, very simple example, phlebotomy services. There's 400 appointments a week. That doesn't need to be in a hospital. Could that be as part of this, health on a high street offering for this new Cavell centre in a regen part of Plymouth? You can imagine the small businesses, being very supportive of something which guarantees so many appointments and footfall to a place. So it's just different ways of thinking about things, pushing beyond the clinical, pushing beyond, just the cost metrics to understand what we can do, which is the better, the best thing we can do for our place, making our populations both better and better off. What's interesting is NHS England are working on the 6, but they're taking the lessons to the Treasury, and hopefully they're making a pitch to roll out these Cavell centres much more in a systematic way after the CSR, trying to get some money from the Treasury. So it could well be the case that across different parts of London there are a raft of new Cavell centre community and primary care hubs being developed. How can we make sure they're not just NHS organised, things? How can we almost take the NHS badge off, the lozenge which we guard so preciously off some of these? How can we make it fit and adapt and work for the local place? How can we have it on the high street? I think that's a great example. And I'll leave it there, Noel. I think for me, there's 2 questions which perhaps most relevant for today. The first one of those is, I guess, what experiences do we have collectively of working across that health and local government divide on issues like this, and how can we maximise any coming opportunities? This is such a timely issue. And the second one is a bit more wider. How can, for me, this is almost a Ronseal test. Sometimes when I speak to NHS colleagues, they struggle to conceptualise or see what they could do to support the economy and that social impact. For me, this is the Ronseal test. We all professionally and personally understand our high streets. We understand that we have a stake in their success. So I'm hopeful that this can get us in more typical conversations about these issues. The bit there in red, I guess, is more reflective, that comes out of those 2 questions, really about what is our role in this, and we can pick that up as comments come up. Please give me a follow on Twitter, and I'll stop sharing the screen now, Noel, and we can have a chat.
No, that was really great, Michael, and it was really great to see to see the approach, and also to see those examples brought to life, like right across literally right across the country, and also also like in different ways, whether, you know, kind of the work in Merseyside involving kind of local residents, and kind of the work in Kent as well, you know, kind of right in the centre of like a shopping mall. It'd be really interesting to see kind of like what impacts that has on people that may not traditionally use health services, but because they're, you know, walking past on the high street and they're curious, then they kind of pop in, and, you know, like what happens to their experience of health, and like, you know, and of their, you know, and of their kind of social networks as a result. I've got a question. I can see there's a couple of questions in here as well. So kind of on the high streets, you've got like a range of public services, and you've also got like a range of shops, some of which whose contribution to health may be positive, and others, you know, kind of maybe more kind of negative as well. So I guess there's something which is what role can health and local government play to work with kind of businesses and shops whose kind of business model is dedicated towards kind of selling unhealthy food, for example. And I guess there are other examples of unhealthy practices on the high street. It'd be really good to hear about that.
I'll just say something quickly on that, Noel, because I'm sure people on the call have some reflections and responses too. The Ashford example is interesting because what they started doing, them being part of the shopping centre, aroused lots of interest from the businesses in that shopping centre. You can imagine some of what was in a shopping centre were your chains, your Marks and Sparks, or whatever it was. Actually, what the One U shop started doing was running some health days and getting some of those local businesses in a shopping centre involved in it. Could be in relation to, you know, maternity. It could be in relation to healthy food. They started using the power and the influence that them being, and actually understanding that they brought a lot of footfall into the shopping centre. So they started talking to their colleagues in the different businesses about what they could do to support some of their campaigns. So I think that's a great example in practice. I think there is something about how influential is the NHS more generally in the makeup of our high street. Now, if we don't get involved in those conversations, then you're absolutely right. You know, if William Hills, or, you know, if something else opens up, we've almost excused ourselves from that conversation, and we pick up the pieces afterwards. So I'm really interested in, and there might be some examples on the call of people who have either successfully or unsuccessfully tried bringing in NHS colleagues into this conversation. You know, I mean, certainly if you look at your high street now, there will be empty shops. What's going to be there? It doesn't have to be something permanent, does it? You know, so in Walsall, talking about, could public services, you know, lead on some pop-ups to fill that empty shop void in ways which, you know, can get people interested in the range of health and care careers? 350 careers in the NHS alone. You know, could we have a simple workforce academy pop-up, you know, where people just sits at a desk and talks about lots of interesting options? And if anyone's got any examples, then please do come in and share them and let us know, you know.
No, definitely. I'll bring in Beatrice first, and then maybe Jamie as well, who's put an idea in the chat about a civic supermarket. Beatrice, do come in.
Oh, thanks, Noel. And I just want to say it's fantastic working with Michael. He's gone through a huge amount very fast, but the richness in it will you'll be able to pick up on the slides. But I particularly liked your query, Noel, or your point about bringing people into health services who might not have accessed them before because they're walking past. And the point about the library model that we're operating, which we started in 2016, and it's rolling out is as we can afford to fund it with other people as well, is it's doing precisely what you're saying. It's putting something into a community which is used to losing things and is not associated with ill health, but as a place which is already trusted, known, and is already part of the community. And then what we're now finding is that people are sort of starting to come in and want to be referred through to other services. So it also is now starting as a bit of a shop front. But the real point, and we've got lots of evidence, we've done longitudinal studies on it now, is that it's stopping people having to access other services. So the point you're actually making around is creating friendships, social infrastructure support, and it's done naturally because somebody feels it's a nice place and that it's a safe place and they already know it. And in communities like we're all familiar with, it's a beautiful place, and I don't underestimate the importance of that, where we know how difficult it is for people living in homes which are cramped, crowded, you can't afford to heat them. And so there's a whole lot of social links in it which are not seen by the recipients, but we know are making influential changes into people's lives.
That's I'm not on mute anymore. No, that's a really great testimony of kind of like the transformation that can happen. And I want to bring in kind of Jamie, if you want to maybe as Jamie Bishop, you shared kind of ideas you're exploring around creating a civic supermarket, because that bounces off something that kind of Michael was just picking up, which is that kind of structurally there have been empty shops on the high street, and unfortunately as a result of the pandemic that's only increased. So it'd be great if you could kind of share briefly your civic supermarket idea.
Thanks for that, Noel. Really quickly, it wasn't the civic supermarket, was actually the client's phrase, which we just loved. And what they were doing, it was a council was the primary client. They had a head lease on a building which was soon a very large former supermarket space that was going to become empty. And their idea was to look at sort of initially some temporary decants of library services and some of the council services into this space. And then it started to snowball, and we started to talk about, a PCN hub coming in there. So we had kind of 3 or 4 GPs interested. And then we had the local DG Leach was interested in putting some services in there, and we looked at some of their less good spaces. And it all started to really add up, because you've got a place that had London's site had a incredibly high PTAL rating, so really accessible, really convenient, so works really well for the council and their agenda around the town centre. But then you flip that around and you look at, like, that's accessible, that's what that's really kind of almost consumer driven health, and then it also works really nicely on this kind of not sort of branding it as medicine or as the cure. It's about well-being, and it's mixing it with the library, the children's services, the wellness to work. The cab was going in there, and it's a really nice thing. And I think probably the thing I take away from it is there's often a knee-jerk reaction that these big box spaces aren't suitable to be reworked into healthcare. Lots of fears around natural light, particularly, and ventilation. It is hard, but they can get over them. And I think it's almost the opportunity is so big, and it's such a pressing need for high street. I think the health has a huge opportunity, and it really plays into this idea of an anchor. It's really spot on what Mike was talking about in that way. So I hope that gives a bit of an idea.
Is it happening, that, Jamie? Is it sort of, is it in progress? Are you trying to, what was the NHS? I mean, lots of interest from the NHS. I'm just curious about the process. There'll be many obstacles, as you say, but where is it in train?
Okay, it was actually it ran into the pandemic last year. But at that stage, we'd got the CCG and the secondary care provider well on board, and the scheme was progressing. It was looking also for some mayoral funding. The lease issues, I think, but very specifically, I think as a test case, there's a lot of possible ideas from it. And it also, we'd been at a presentation where there was talk about the move on the high streets away from shopping towards a high street of services. And we'd previously worked with some big, some very large supermarkets looking at health as well. And you look at the footfall that particularly even a GP, one GP's presence could drive something like 2,000 visits, to that site through a year, and that starts that's kind of anchor tenant kind of territory already. And it's just there's too often a disconnect from the civic responsibility, I guess, from the NHS in this and where that money is spent and how it's spent, the added value they get from it.
Matt, did you want to come in on your question about ways that health services can contribute to the place-based focus? You mentioned healthy streets.
I'm happy to. I'm Matt. I work at PHE London, supporting health equity around our recovery bit. So just came straight out of a meeting about recovery missions, which is good. I think Michael sort of answered it in your response to the last one, but I'm kind of interested in, like, I think the examples you've given are really interested about sort of tangible, practical, taking over a space to provide a health service. I was kind of interested with a public health and council background about sort of the health gain of a high street itself. And so I've shared in the chat the TfL's brilliant 10 healthy streets indicators. And so just, I guess, thinking a bit about what is the, and bringing that really good anchor thinking about what are the opportunities for the NHS by supporting place-based well-being, and also what are their levers. And so, closer working, integrated working with the local authority will provide lots of those. One great example would be alcohol licensing outside of planning, but that ability to influence what's on the high street, but also then thinking about their role as a purchaser, and also frankly their role as a landlord as well, because understanding what Michael said early on about cost decisions, actually the social output of being a landlord that provides a more social support to people, I think is one of the really interesting. So just examples where people have taken a slightly more strategic look at how they've supported their local community.
I think this is where it comes down to almost that point about, for me, this is the Ronseal test, Matt, where if you think about this, you can visualize then that the anchor concept has a mooring, doesn't it? If you think about what one of the challenges from the NHS as an anchor concept, we can get it conceptually, but one of the challenges often when it comes to in practice is the NHS is not particularly good at understanding its local industrial base. So what services can be provided from the local area? Well, first of all, we're not entirely sure what's in our local area, before we go about that. So I think there's something about, if we're going to understand and embed social value in a far more systematic way than we've done in the moment, and this is where we really want local government to come in and to support us. So Noel, it's that classic. I could be Bart's Health Trust to do lots of good stuff in your patch. I could be a primary care network. I could be, a district general. If I wanted to take the first steps on social value and understanding my own value and what's out there, and what policies to use, one of my recommendations is always to get in touch with your local government colleagues. And I think, how can we get the policy and the strategy and the economic development arm of local government in a room with some of the health colleagues making these decisions? All too often, the NHS sees social care, or Matt, you're absolutely right, it might see public health, but we need to play much more active role in place shaping, don't we? And local government as we know is multifaceted. Are we routinely speaking to the right part of local government is a classic question that I always ask.
Yeah, I think that's good. No, I think it's really helpful to continue to think of the NHS as a service provider, not necessarily a place leader, but that's getting really murky, isn't it? Between like who runs and leads that, and actually who realistically should be part of those conversations. So yeah, thanks, Michael.
I think this is a conversation in every complex organisation that you have in understanding what levers you've got as an organisation. So even in a council, there's sometimes an assumption that kind of your main levers are you either deliver a service or you fund the commissioning of a service or via grant, whereas actually there's a wide range of soft and hard levers, and you might not necessarily know the extent to which you can use those levers. So actually, kind of a way to be able to directly connect like a planner with a GP, or kind of like a social worker with environmental health officer, or sometimes even within organisations is a challenge, not like logistical challenge, but just because people don't necessarily know like each other's roles, and they might be working on kind of on similar issues. So I think that practical collaboration is very important. And I think there's definitely something about supporting or kind of identifying who are those different roles between different organisations, you know, health and local government, who work on the high street kind of on a systematic basis, whether that's, you know, physically on the high street, or, you know, like in the case of a planner, more spatially, and enable them to work at that high street neighbour based level to be able to work those issues out and devolve power, or, you know, kind of or budgets to be able to experiment, and not just having having kind of plans or strategies, whether they're health in local government, which are at a borough or CCG kind of level, because sometimes that's too high up in the clouds. If that makes sense.
Kate's put a really interesting point just made about the health and well-being and linked into culture as well, you know. And so I live down in Brighton, you know. If you know, the Brighton Festival, as you know, pandemic has put paid to the Brighton Festival is a huge economic driver for Brighton, you know, and it's that vibrancy which maintains, you know, Brighton's health and wealth. And so I think there's a particularly strong cultural link there. And Louise mentioned something about workforce examples. This is a great example. So Louise, in Northwest London, you know, that I don't know if you've been for your jab and you've seen the vaccination, you know, program. It's huge, isn't it? And so we've so I know 4,000 workers from Heathrow are now working for the on the NHS vaccination program in Northwest London, and we're in the NHS now. We're trying to work out how to support people who've volunteered for the vaccination program into a range of, you know, into one of the careers in health and care. A huge opportunity there. Likewise, in the same part of London, they worked out that NHS jobs was actually a barrier to getting a job in the NHS, because often it asks for prior NHS experience, where you don't need prior NHS experience for many. So actually, they're working with the West London Alliance. They're looking at a jobs brokerage system to try and support people from certain parts of the community to get jobs in health and care. So I do think the workforce aspect is huge, and we know the scale of the opportunity, but we also know that it's, you know, it's going to take a lot of quite clever thinking, but really keen to get, you know, to look at that in particular, Louise, on the workforce perspective.
And there's a question, Michael, from Karen about evidence on kind of the benefits to local communities of positioning healthcare on the high streets. And Beatrice kind of shared evidence from the kind of the work that she's doing. Is there evidence that's being collected on different pilots or different projects, or that can kind of help build a case for change?
It's interesting. We do need this. And what's interesting, so you're right, Beatrice, of course, as a chair of an NHS trust, was in a leadership position where, you know, they were able to move, you know, to take over the library, but also to show some of the evidence behind the health impacts of that, which is absolutely vital. What I would say is there's probably not a huge wealth of evidence from the NHS perspective. Public Health England might have some, actually. So part of the pandemic is about the opportunity of us taking a step, but part of, you know, the Cavell Centre thinking and lots of, you know, and some of the, you know, and the One Use shop, and some of the, you know, I'm working with a hospital plan in Grimsby where they've developed a social and economic impact assessment of what they're doing. Part of we need to bring together some of this, you know, this progress into a clearly defined evidence base that can impact on the Treasury decision making and can impact on local decision making. So I guess we're in the sense of opportunity now, Noel, and we need to make sure that we maximise those opportunities where they arise. But you're absolutely right. We are pulling together something which is far more, you know, empirical and clear than perhaps we've got in the past. You know, and you know, this is, you know, if we need to change NHS commissioning and process, but we also want to change government decision making and, and how money flows in local government. So what's fascinating is the evidence base probably crosses a few sectors, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And just on that, from where I was before, we worked with a famous property developer to develop a loneliness lab, and it wasn't based on the high street, but it was kind of very close to the high street in Euston, and it was about how do you influence the master planning, as well as experiments that you might do in like meanwhile space in the run up to a big regeneration to tackle loneliness. And loneliness like kind of plays out in different ways, and this was a like a big commitment for them. It was obviously already a priority for the council, and so there's something about the roles of organisations that have maybe an even more significant influence on the high street than actually the shops. So the people that own the different parts of the high street, as well as the people that are property developers that are maybe don't own parts of the high street, but definitely own parts of the environment around the high street, and so are really important organisations that can link into this and that can invest in health to connect high street to wider people's neighbourhoods as well. And I was wondering if there was any work, Michael, and other people in the chat between kind of property developers and putting health on the high street.
What's been interesting is lots of property developers have responded to the report and wanted to start conversations because they see the value of this. What's fascinating, and this is again, I'd be interested in any experience because this is slightly above my pay grade. Often one of the financing presents a huge challenge here. So the NHS will, your hospital rebuild, wherever you are, is, there's national funding, so in Brighton, £500 million of Treasury funding for a new hospital. Often the NHS works on the basis we either get something centrally funded or it doesn't happen. PFI 1, PFI 2, there's huge political pressure on those now, so actually there will be a raft of PFI hospitals coming back, the contracts coming up in the next decade, which is going to be long-standing questions. We have been shall we say or turned away from private finance by the government, by the Department of Health. Any local NHS colleagues complain about the threats on the Department of Health are going to break their CDEL limits, etc., etc. There's huge challenges about unlocking some of that big scale financing, and we know the private developers who are coming to us with this question, it's a current question, Noel, and we do need to work out maybe some examples of how partnerships can get around that question for the NHS, which is either we get £500 million or nothing happens.
Absolutely, and I think it is that kind of that paradox where the high street is at such a human scale that you can definitely experiment, but there are wider processes and bureaucracies that go far beyond that. That sometimes constrain that, and that's not just the high street on that. We've got also got some great kind of comments and some further evidence on how some of the examples like the one use stop shop kind of came about, which I think is really important, because sometimes it can be kind of specific people that help bring things about, but sometimes it's also a sequence of different steps that are taken by different actors to bring something to life, and sometimes those are well planned and orchestrated, and sometimes there's a mixture of planning and fortuity which makes one thing happen and another thing not. I'm conscious of time, and it was really great.
Can I just say something about the bids, Noel?
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say, do you want to offer some concluding thoughts or anything else that jumps to mind, including the bids?
I mean, the One Use Shop's a great example that you don't need perfection straight away, do you? You know, something, especially in the absence of evidence, evolving that, you know, they started the process, and then, you know, then they were able to show the clinicians locally the value of it, as you know, and they grew their premises and they moved. So I think the One Use Shop is a great example that actually be opportunistic, start small, bring partners together, then we can build. There's a question about the bids and developers. It's interesting, not many NHS colleagues will be really aware and working closely with their bids. You know, it's not a routine conversation for us. And yet, you know, I was in Newcastle talking with actually, you know, the bids up there is, you know, it's you know, in nighttime economy, it helps it's reduced any attendances, it's helped the NHS workforce staff feel safe walking home with the street lighting. It paid for, you know, the bit of sand under the Tyne Bridge and a new bar which the staff love. It's actually all of this is all of these relationships have a role in our recruitment and retention. You know, we've got chronic workforce issues, you know, 100,000 vacancies, all of these relationships, you know, actually and I think the anchor concept does more of them, enable us to have different conversations. And what I'm concerned about is sometimes we're not having these conversations. You know, I think so, you know, if health on the high street can get people talking to each other in new ways, then for me, I think, you know, I'm absolutely fascinated, Noel, and happy to support and come on board with where it can get to. But if we're not in the same room having the conversations, we're not going to get anywhere, are we? I think for me, this is a conversation broker, and I think it can then go in a myriad of ways. And, you know, and really keen for you and colleagues on the call to follow up separately with examples, or trying to push it through to the next stage, and, you know, and trying to work out where we can get to on this, because the opportunity is here, isn't it?
No, absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, such a kind of wide-ranging conversation with some really great examples, and definitely one of the things we want to do here with the network is obviously invite people from local government to speak about experiences, but also other players that maybe we don't interact with as much, or maybe have in the room as much, to understand their perspectives. So, you know, people in the chat talked about kind of engineers, or like you talked about business improvement districts, and, you know, property developers or supermarkets. So, you know, if you know of any of those that would want to come and talk about, you know, kind of a specific issue which links into local places, then we definitely kind of welcome that, because, as you say, like, we need to have the conversation, and then people can, you know, go away and kind of make their own connections. So thanks again, Michael. It was a really great presentation, and we'll kind of share the slides later. And there's a Health on the High Street report as well, that we can share. I shared in the link earlier the link to the Greater London Authority High Streets for All funding challenge. I don't work for the GLA, so I'm not kind of promoting it on their behalf per se, but just because it looks like a really good funding opportunity. There's also, and again, I'm not promoting this on behalf of the government, but there's also a community ownership fund, which isn't specifically aimed at high streets, but is about how communities can kind of take over unused civic spaces. And so there will undoubtedly, as we've discovered today, be those on the high streets as well. So definitely kind of use the ideas and reflection from this discussion to take back to your organisations. But obviously, where there are funding opportunities, that can all help us scale up the work that we're trying to do. Next week, we've got a session which is about strategic partnerships. So, you know, how do we kind of use our strategic partnership boards, which links in partly to discussion today, because we were talking about, you know, who our anchor partners are on the high street. So do come along to that. Otherwise, have a great great afternoon, and thanks everyone for joining, and thanks again, Michael.
Thanks,
Thank
Noel.
you.
Thanks, everyone.